In the gilded halls of royalty, power wasn't the only thing passed down. Behind the portraits, beneath the crowns, a darker inheritance festered, whispered in corridors, hidden in treatments, and buried in royal tombs. Syphilis, the disease no court dared name, but one that may have shaped dynasties, dethroned kings, and rewritten the bloodline of Britain. These are not just rumors. They're royal secrets inflamed, denied, and left to rot behind velvet curtains. 25 monarchs, one invisible plague. Welcome to the history they still don't want to diagnose. Before we dive headfirst into the royal rot, take a second to subscribe, especially if you like your history unsettling, unresolved, and slightly contagious. Let us know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it on your end. We want to know who else is wandering the internet with questionable taste in bedtime stories. 1. King Henry VIII, 1491 to 1547. By the time King Henry VIII died, bloated and ulcer-ridden in his private chambers at Whitehall, England had changed. The monasteries were gone. The papacy was excommunicated and 6 women had played roulette with a royal wedding ring. And beneath the religious revolutions and marital decapitations, another rumor never quite died. That Henry himself was eaten from the inside out by syphilis is not a new rumor. In fact, it's almost too old, too convenient. The kind of whisper that starts as idle court gossip and metastasizes into historical shorthand. Mad King, too many wives, probably syphilis. But the question isn't whether he had it. The question is why people wanted him to have it. There's a peculiar British instinct to explain cruelty through disease. It softens the blow. Henry didn't murder his wives, you see. The disease did. He didn't tear the Church of England from Rome. Syphilis eroded his reason. It's not personal. It's pathological. And if history has taught us anything, it's that pathology is always preferable to plain old bad character. To be fair, Henry gave people plenty of material to work with. In his later years, his body collapsed into itself like a rotting empire. Chronic leg ulcers, mysterious headaches, fits of rage, memory loss, paranoia, weight gain that could terrify gravity. Physicians treated him with mercury-laced salves. A classic cure for syphilis at the time, which only made him worse. The royal court banned mirrors in his presence, lest he be confronted with what he had become. If that's not a man slowly decomposing from within, what is? Except not all historians agree. In recent decades, the pendulum of royal diagnosis has swung toward more respectable explanations. Cushing syndrome, type 2 diabetes, a possible traumatic brain injury from a 1536 jousting accident. All tidy, scientific, retroactively plausible. All very boring. You could almost hear history yawn. But the syphilis theory lingers like an unpaid debt. Because it's not just about medical symptoms. It's about symbolism. Syphilis in the early modern imagination was punishment. Not just any punishment, but divine, moral, poetic punishment. A disease that stripped you of beauty, sanity, dignity, that made you monstrous. That made you earn your sins on your face and bones. It was God's own Yelp review. And so Henry's grotesque decline seemed to many suspiciously on the nose. This was the man who declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, then systematically gutted that church for land and profit. The man who broke with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, then beheaded her. The man who imprisoned his daughters, executed his friends, and transformed wives into court fixtures with the shelf life of meat. Syphilis made the whole mess easier to swallow. If nothing else, it made him human and then less than human. There were, of course, practical obstacles to confirming the rumor. His physician's records were opaque at best, and the Tudor court's entire medical apparatus functioned less as a system of healing and more as a theater of secrecy. Diagnoses were delivered in Latin. Symptoms were described metaphorically. Treatments were done behind closed doors with royal apothecaries and alchemists whose job was less to cure and more to conceal. In that climate, an ugly truth, especially one involving genitals, had no chance of escaping the velvet curtain. And yet, Mercury keeps showing up, not just in Henry's chambers, but in his court's prescriptions, salves, and antidotes. It was the go-to treatment for syphilis throughout Europe. Applied topically, injected subcutaneously, or if the poor soul was especially unlucky, boiled into steam and inhaled in closed rooms. That's the part they never put in the official portraits. So maybe he didn't have it, or maybe he did, but the diagnosis was buried 6 feet deep in an era that fed on denial. What's fascinating isn't the answer. It's the way the question refuses to die. Even 5 centuries later, we can't help but look at that smirking portrait of Henry in his prime, velvet sleeves bulging, codpiece front and center, and think this man was not well. And maybe that's the true mark of his illness. Not what he suffered, but what he made others suffer under the illusion of divine right and personal invincibility. A king who believed himself too powerful to rot until he did. But if Henry was the disease, who did he infect? The next royal on our list inherited no crown, yet his reputation died just as mysteriously, and his body, some say, showed the same silent symptoms. 2. King Edward IV, 1442 to 1483. There are kings who die in battle, swords drawn, banners raised, remembered for their glorious exits. And then there's Edward IV, who died quietly, inconveniently, and suspiciously young at the age of 40. No arrows, no final speeches, no noble wounds to mythologize, just gone. And in his absence, a void quickly filled by whispers. For centuries, Edward's death was attributed to a fever or exhaustion or pneumonia, depending on which chronicler you preferred and which political faction paid their salary. But in 2023, a controversial academic paper resurfaced a theory that had long simmered beneath the surface. What if Edward IV didn't just die? What if he decayed? The claim was bold. It framed his abrupt deterioration not as the result of overwork or bad weather, but as the slow corrosive collapse of late-stage syphilis, specifically tertiary syphilis, the kind that chews through your nervous system like royal woodworm, silently, persistently, and with ironic precision. And it wasn't just modern speculation. Contemporary observers noted that Edward, once praised for his towering physique and golden looks, began to suffer from recurring skin lesions and debilitating fatigue in the last years of his reign. He had once been the Adonis of the Yorkist cause. 6'4", strikingly handsome, a king whose very appearance was said to inspire battlefield loyalty. By 1483, he had become something else. Bloated, worn, unsteady. Then there were the habits. Edward was known for his lavish indulgences in food, in drink, and in women. A man of dissolute habits, according to more than one chronicler. He fathered numerous illegitimate children and maintained a private life that even by 15th century standards raised eyebrows. And while promiscuity is not proof of illness, it certainly oils the wheels of rumor, especially when your sudden death is accompanied by an official silence so loud it practically screams. The royal accounts from his final days are riddled with euphemisms. No explicit cause of death is listed. No detailed autopsy recorded. Just a brief, almost embarrassed announcement that the king had expired. And then a mad dash for succession, which conveniently shifted public attention to the fates of his sons, the fated princes in the Tower. But certain details left behind in diaries, letters, and foreign dispatches remain hard to ignore. Reports of the king's sores, references to plasters and ointments of curious composition, and not so subtle remarks about his restless nights. Court physicians, when they are mentioned, are described as treating him with elemental tinctures, likely a coded reference to mercury, the reigning wonder drug of the venereal age. And let's talk about mercury for a moment. If a king was being treated with it, there were only two likely possibilities: alchemical dabbling or venereal disease. Edward IV wasn't an alchemist. He was, however, a man whose lifestyle practically invited medical consequence. Even the foreign courts, who often knew more than their English counterparts, were puzzled by his decline. Ambassadors noted his changing appearance, his isolation, and the sudden acceleration of his illness in early 1483. Some letters from the Burgundian court refer cryptically to the wasting affliction of the English king, a phrase as poetic as it is ominous. Still, no diagnosis was ever made public, no confirmation, only the quiet burial of a king who had once been larger than life and who left behind a kingdom teetering on civil war. And perhaps that's why the syphilis theory persists, because it explains the otherwise inexplicable. How a monarch at the peak of his power, charismatic, militarily victorious, feared and admired, could unravel so quickly, so completely, and so conveniently. But history rarely gives clean answers, especially when those answers risk undermining the grandeur of a dynasty. The Yorkist legacy required a strong Edward, a virile Edward, a man whose death was tragic, not embarrassing. So the whispers stayed whispers until someone dug them back up centuries later and re-examined the evidence through a modern lens. Of course, even if Edward IV was infected, we'll never know where it came from. A lover, a conquest, a court liaison whose name was never recorded. Syphilis, after all, doesn't care about royal blood. It doesn't respect titles or banners. It simply waits. And sometimes it passes its inheritance not through children or crowns, but through silence. Because as soon as Edward died, someone else stepped up to take the throne and to leave his own trail of affliction. A monarch known not for his death, but for how long he lived in the shadow of a disease he refused to name. If you've made it this far, you're clearly not afraid of a little royal rot. So why not subscribe for more late-night dives into history's most uncomfortable corners? Drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Midnight, noon, somewhere in between. Let's see how far this strange little rabbit hole reaches. 3. King Charles II, 1630 to 1685. When King Charles II died, the British monarchy didn't just lose its merry monarch. It lost the most committed patron of distraction in royal history. Charles had spent his entire reign cloaking political decay in velvet, powdered wigs, and private theatricals. A man who ruled through charisma and charm, even as his body betrayed him organ by organ. But buried beneath the laughter and lace was a quieter suspicion that Charles II, master of appearances, had been hiding something far less decorative. The slow private torment of a venereal affliction, likely syphilis. Now, to be clear, Charles wasn't exactly famous for moderation. His court was a rolling masquerade of mistresses, masquerades, and monthly scandals. At one point, Parliament itself complained that Whitehall had more courtesans than quarters. Charles didn't deny it. He seemed to enjoy turning monarchy into a kind of elaborate punchline, as if to say, "Yes, I'm sleeping with your wife. Yes, I'm also the head of state. What of it?" The public laughed. The nobles gossiped. And meanwhile, the king's physicians quietly stocked up on mercury. Because as much as Charles was known for pleasure, he was equally known for his mysterious and recurring ailments. Throughout his later life, he suffered from bouts of fatigue, facial rashes, splitting headaches, trembling hands, and sharp pains in his legs. Sometimes he was seen applying strange ointments. Sometimes he vanished from court entirely for days at a time. And more than once his mistresses, many of them famous in their own right, were noted to have suffered sudden illnesses, only to return pale and silent. If they returned at all, of course, none of this is proof. But none of it is easy to explain away either. What is documented and thoroughly is the curious behavior of his royal physicians. Charles's medical records are filled with entries that hint almost artfully at something more serious than fatigue. Tinctures of antimony, preparations of quicks, the application of blistering agents, the drawing of humors through the feet. Every treatment listed reads like the footnotes of a May 17th century syphilis manual. One especially telling moment came during the king's final illness in 1685. After suffering a sudden collapse, Charles was subjected to an exhausting and bizarre regimen. Cupping, bleeding, purging, forced vomiting, and yes, a final dose of mercury vapor. To his credit, he reportedly thanked his doctors for their trouble just before dying under their care. Historians have long debated the cause of death. Apoplexy was the official explanation. Some modern analysts propose chronic kidney failure or even poisoning. But among the darker theories is this, that Charles, who spent his youth in exile and his adulthood in excess, may have contracted syphilis early in life and spent the remainder of it outpacing the consequences until they caught up with him in the most theatrical way possible. There are hints even in his own letters. One particularly odd line written during a minor illness refers to my troublesome inheritance from France. A poetic turn of phrase or a nod to the era's popular term for syphilis, the French disease. And Charles did love France. His mother was French. His favorite mistresses were French. His political leanings, when not swayed by Parliament's purse, often tilted toward Paris. But even more than that, Charles loved ambiguity. He never confirmed, never denied, never explained. When accused of Catholic sympathies, he converted on his deathbed. When accused of political inconsistency, he grinned and deflected. When accused of fathering over a dozen illegitimate children, he shrugged and said, "Odds fish. A king must do his duty." It would be entirely in character then for Charles to suffer in secret while performing joy in public. A king as performer, as illusionist, as misdirection incarnate. But if Charles was hiding an affliction, he wasn't doing it alone. Court insiders whispered of medical emergencies cloaked as poetry readings, of absences explained by melancholy, of a monarch who joked about everything except his own body. And as the Restoration bloomed around him, with theaters reopening and Puritans fleeing back to their quiet corners, Charles continued to laugh, drink, and make the monarchy look, if not holy, at least entertaining. But entertainment has a cost, and behind every mask there's a face. Some said his was pocked, some said pale. All agreed it was tired by the end. And perhaps that's why the rumor survived. Because even as his portraits show him full of mirth and confidence, there's something haunted in the eyes. The eyes of a man who saw too much, tasted too freely, and may have carried something incurable long before the crown ever sat on his head. Still, if Charles ruled through performance, the next monarch played the opposite role entirely. Bookish, awkward, and constantly under suspicion. A man whose own health became a political weapon, and whose rumored affliction may have been less biological than metaphorical, though no less contagious. 4. King James I of England, 1566 to 1625. King James I was not a romantic figure. He didn't inspire grand paintings or heroic ballads. He wasn't known for battlefield, valor, or courtly charm, or even fashionable taste. He was above all a reader, a man more at home among books and theological arguments than broadswords and courtly gossip. And yet from the moment he took the English throne in 6003, a shadow followed him. The persistent rumor that James, Scotland's awkward king turned English monarch, had once contracted the French disease. It was not a friendly whisper. It was politically charged, barbed with the prejudices of the day, and soaked in satire. 17th century, England was a nation addicted to pamphlets, and King James, with his limp, his lisp, and his suspicion of physical touch, made a perfect target. Writers mocked his appearance, his voice, his court favorites, and in more poisonous corners, his health. The French disease. They whispered, sometimes with a sneer, sometimes with poetic flourish. The euphemism was so common, it almost became code. One part political slander, one part medical suggestion, and one part poetic license. The idea that James may have suffered from syphilis has always been speculative. A footnote in the vast and contradictory book of Jacobean rumor. There were no clear records, no royal confession, just pamphlets, satirical plays, and letters from foreign diplomats who knew better than to print the words directly. What historians do agree on is that James was chronically unwell in his later years. He suffered from arthritis, kidney stones, painful digestive issues, and skin conditions that sometimes flared with no clear cause. He complained often of headaches and mysterious fevers, and toward the end of his life, he endured recurring attacks of what was described as O-term that covered everything from malaria to nervous tremors to, in some cases, neurosyphilis. Even his childhood health had been fraught. James was born prematurely, and he walked with a slight limp due to what modern scholars believe may have been rickets or a mild case of cerebral palsy. None of this is evidence of syphilis, but it added to the public impression that James was fragile, physically soft in a world that still idolized virility. Still, the syphilis rumors stuck for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with optics. James was deeply unpopular with certain factions in both England and Scotland, especially Puritans and English nobles who viewed him as too Scottish, too Catholic-friendly, too intellectual, too reliant on male quarters. Accusing a king of disease wasn't just gossip. It was subversion, a way to delegitimize the body politic by pathizing the body itself. The irony is that James himself was obsessed with cleanliness, spiritual and moral, if not always physical. He wrote treatises on witchcraft, tobacco, and monarchy. He commissioned the King James Bible, arguably the most influential literary project in English history, and he governed with a cautious, almost loyally approach to power. He was not reckless. He was not flamboyant. If he had suffered from a disease, it would have been buried under layers of silence and formality, like everything else in his guarded inner world. Still, his skin troubles and mysterious treatments are notable. Records from his physicians mention curious baths and herbal tinctures used for swellings of the limbs. Mercury once again makes a brief appearance, listed only as a trace component in one of his more obscure prescriptions. The dosage is never specified. The purpose is never explained, which is fitting really. James ruled in riddles. He debated theologians for sport. He spoke in metaphors. He wrote about the divine right of kings as if it were a term of personal salvation. He wanted to be remembered as a Solomon, wise, serene, a monarch of letters. But history is never so cooperative, because long after the words fade, what people remember is the body. How it walked, how it shook, how it decayed. And James, despite his intellectual accomplishments, was never able to escape the suspicion that something was wrong under the robes and ruffles, that the mind may have been sharp, but the flesh not quite so sound. The next monarch didn't fare much better. His reign was decadent, scandalous, and visibly rotting from the inside out. And unlike James, he made no effort to hide the excess. If anything, he flaunted it. 5. King George IV, 1762 to 1830. It is difficult to say whether King George IV was more reviled for his politics or his waistline. A man so extravagantly detested that even his own mother is rumored to have disliked him. George IV occupies a peculiar place in the royal imagination. Not quite a villain, not quite a fool, but something worse. A man whose life spiraled into such garish self-indulgence that it seemed to mock the very idea of monarchy. He was crowned late, ruled briefly, and scandalized constantly. And among the many rumors that trailed him of affairs, debts, disguises, and disastrous marriages, one lingers with a strange persistence: that in his early years, George contracted a venereal disease, more specifically syphilis. The official records, as usual, say nothing directly. They never do, but the unofficial accounts, the journals, private correspondence, and carefully worded physician's notes tell a more ambiguous tale. In his youth, George was known to frequent the darker corners of George and London. Not just the salons and theaters, but the clubs that required no invitation and offered no protection from consequences. He pursued relationships with courtesans, actresses, dancers, and anyone else who caught his attention. And he had the money, or at least the borrowed appearance of it, to make sure attention was paid in return. Biographers from the 19th and 20th centuries regularly noted that George was treated throughout his life for various indispositions, a phrase that often masked far more than it revealed. What we know with some certainty is that he was frequently unwell. He experienced recurring skin outbreaks, mysterious swellings, chronic eye pain, and periods of near invalidism. One personal physician referred to treating the prince for a disorder not uncommon among the young of his rank: the treatment mercury. Again, the word appears: mercury, the toxic darling of predator medicine. It was the go-to remedy for syphilis across Europe. Despite its own long list of side effects, including tremors, gum disease, and neurological decline, if George IV was being treated with it, and he was repeatedly, then the suspicion of syphilis gains a certain gravitational pull. By middle age, George's body was collapsing under the weight of its own indulgences. His weight ballooned to over 250 pounds. His eyesight deteriorated, and his breath was said to carry a scent that lingered in a room long after he left. Court artists had to invent flattering angles just to paint him. He wore corsets to contain himself, and even though strained against the royal girth. And underneath the satin and lace, his body bore the signs of a life lived in continual excess and perhaps chronic treatment. One physician noted swellings of a private nature. Another described recurring episodes of fever and malaise. And the third mentioned trials of the calm tincture, a mercury compound frequently used to treat venereal infections. George naturally offered no clarification. His public persona was a combination of denial and distraction, elaborate pageantry, cartoonish fashion, and a parade of public performances that seemed designed to keep attention anywhere but the royal sickbed. Even the royal marriage was a farce. His union with Caroline of Brunswick was cold from the beginning and deteriorated into one of the most grotesquely public marital breakdowns in European history. Caroline accused George of various improprieties. George returned fire with accusations of his own, including rumors, unproven but persistent, that she too had brought back a foreign infection from her travels. None of this proved anything, of course. It never does. But George IV's health problems did not endear him to a public that already saw him as vain, wasteful, and out of touch. He died alone, suffering from a complex stew of ailments: gout, dropsy, and possibly something older, more buried. Something that had traveled with him for decades, mutating, recurring, reshaping itself beneath the surface. Because George IV's body was more than a source of gossip. It was a reflection of empire, bloated, opulent, overextended, and slowly breaking down under its own illusions. And yet even he didn't descend quite as fast as the next royal in line. A man of danger, addiction, and reckless desire whose short, scandal-soaked life left behind just enough evidence to spark a century of speculation and just enough silence to keep the questions alive. 6. Prince George, Duke of Kent, 1902 to 1942. Prince George was supposed to be different. The fourth son of King George V. He arrived in the world at a time when royalty was learning how to adapt, to modernize, to look good on camera while quietly shedding its medieval layers. He was born into a world of uniforms and obligations, but lived briefly and brightly, as if he were auditioning for something else entirely. Celebrity, perhaps, or infamy. Tall, handsome, and absurdly photogenic, George looked more like a movie star than a royal. And in many ways, he lived like one. He was charismatic, well-dressed, dangerously charming, and constantly, almost compulsively escaping the role he was assigned. He moved between military posts and jazz clubs, from diplomatic missions to opium dens. He had affairs with artists, aristocrats, and at least one rumored spy. And somewhere in that reckless trajectory, a rumor quietly took root that Prince George, Duke of Kent, had contracted syphilis. Now, there are no official records of this. Of course, there aren't. By the 1920s, the royal archives were polished to a mirror sheen, and every blot on the family name was either erased or rephrased in the most hygienic language available. But the rumors didn't need permission to survive. They came from memoirs, private letters, and disapproving glances from palace insiders. And more than one biographer decades later would note that George underwent a series of curious medical treatments, discreet, experimental, and suspiciously consistent with the management of venereal disease. The context makes the theory plausible, if not conclusive. The interwar years were a time of flamboyant denial when Europe's elite dabbled in everything and denied everything else. Prince George fit right in. He traveled constantly, socialized indiscriminately, and surrounded himself with a crowd that would have sent his Victorian ancestors into cardiac arrest. He partied with Noel Coward, befriended Marlene Dietrich, and was linked, if only through gossip, to a list of lovers that included both men and women, none of whom were vetted by the palace. And then there were the drugs. It's well documented that George battled substance addiction. He was treated multiple times for what official statements called exhaustion and nervous disorders, which in royal language could mean anything from morphine dependency to undisclosed infections. During one particularly well-covered incident, he was reportedly confined to a clinic under a false name. No explanation was ever given, but the rumors surged, some involving narcotics, others involving intimate ailments too sensitive for public mention. What lends weight to the syphilis theory is the timing. By the mid-1930s, George began to withdraw slightly from public life. He appeared less frequently in photographs, and when he did, the sparkle seemed dimmed. Some noted changes in his demeanor, increased irritability, a flatness that hadn't been there before. Again, not proof. But when combined with records of skin eruptions, recurring migraines, and sudden disappearances for treatment, the theory gains traction. And then there's the wartime crash. George died suddenly in 1942, when the RAF plane carrying him went down over Quay, Scotland. The official inquiry was vague, and the royal family kept its response characteristically minimal. But his death, like much of his life, left behind more questions than answers. Why was a senior royal on a mysterious military flight during a classified mission? Why were key details of the crash sealed? And why, in the days before his death, had he been reportedly suffering from what one friend called a resurgence of his old illness? Even the way the press handled his death was strange. Obituaries focused on his good looks, his naval service, his patriotism, but avoided at all costs the messier threads of his personal life, the affairs, the clinics, the health. Prince George was the royal who danced too close to the fire. And whether or not syphilis played a part in his decline, it remains one of the whispered variables in a life that refused to stay within the lines. He was the template for the modern scandalous royal. Alluring, troubled, opaque, and his story leads us to a royal even more mysterious. A young prince whose death was just as sudden, just as unexplained, and whose name would later be stitched into conspiracy theories involving murder, madness, and a disease too shameful to be mentioned in public. 7. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, 1864 to 1892. Prince Albert Victor was born to rule, but died as a question mark. The eldest son of the future King Edward III and the grandson of Queen Victoria, he stood second in line to the throne, the crown hovering just within reach. Instead, he vanished at 28, leaving behind a trail of scandals, strange silences, and a whisper that refused to die, that he suffered from syphilis and that the disease may have played a part in his mysterious death. Albert Victor, Eddie to his family, was a man caught between public duty and private confusion. From the moment he entered adulthood, he seemed ill at ease in his role. He was gentle, soft-spoken, and famously vague. Tutors found him intelligent but distractible. Courtiers found him charming but hard to read, and biographers then and now have found him impossible to pin down. He was either the sensitive heart of the Victorian monarchy or its most tragic liability. What's certain is that his reputation suffered from proximity. As a young man, he was linked, not always fairly, to a number of controversies, including one that threatened to bring down the monarchy altogether. The 1889 Cleveland Street Scandal, a high-profile case involving an illegal male brothel and several figures close to the aristocracy. The scandal sent shock waves through Victorian society. Albert Victor was never officially named in the inquiry, but his name surfaced often enough in anonymous letters and press insinuations that damage was done. Whether or not he was involved, the perception stuck that the heir to the throne had been dangerously close to something unspeakable. Around this time, another rumor began to circulate, more private, but just as corrosive, that Albert Victor had contracted a sexually transmitted disease, possibly syphilis, from his escapades in London's underworld. The symptoms, according to whispers from court insiders and retroactive medical speculation, aligned with what followed. Over the next few years, Albert Victor's health became a subject of quiet concern. He suffered from bouts of lethargy, unexplained fevers, and fainting spells. His engagement to Princess Mary of Teck, later Queen Mary, was announced in December 1891. Just a few weeks later, he was dead. The official cause of death was pneumonia, contracted during a severe influenza outbreak that swept through Sandron. But the speed of his decline raised eyebrows. Within days of falling ill, Albert Victor was bedridden, delusional, and then gone. Some speculated that influenza alone couldn't account for the rapid deterioration. Others noted the timing and the uncanny way his death seemed to erase the mounting pressure on the royal family to explain his associations and behavior. Modern medical historians have suggested that if Albert Victor did suffer from latent syphilis, it may have compromised his immune system, making him more vulnerable to complications from influenza. This isn't confirmation, but it's a theory with teeth. One that aligns with scattered reports from physicians about recurring ailments in the years before his death. Mercury was mentioned in some treatments, though vaguely. One personal attendant recalled that the prince had complained often of his nerves and his bones, an echo of the language often used to describe late-stage syphilitic pain. What deepens the mystery is how quickly his memory was sanitized. After his death, Albert Victor was transformed into a figure of pure Victorian sorrow. The lost prince, the angelic heir mourned by the empire. No mention of scandals. No trace of rumors. Even his former fiancée, Princess Mary, was carefully reassigned to his younger brother, George, who would go on to become George V. The crown moved on efficiently. as if Albert Victor had simply been a rehearsal for something more stable. But the rumors didn't die. In fact, they evolved. In the 20th century, Albert Victor's name was bizarrely linked to the Jack the Ripper murders, a theory with no credible evidence, but one fueled by the same instinct that drives the syphilis speculation, that behind the royal facade lurked something darker, something damaged, something desperately hidden. Whether Albert Victor died of the flu or something more shameful, his life remains a portrait of contradiction, privilege without power, visibility without clarity, and the next monarch on our list followed a similar pattern. A king whose public image was spotless, but whose end hinted at a disease that had no respect for crowns. Treaties or official narratives. 8. King William III, 1650 to 1702. King William III, co-ruler with Mary II and architect of the Glorious Revolution, is rarely remembered for his health. More often, he's cited for his Protestant credentials, his military campaigns against Catholic France, and his role in shaping constitutional monarchy. But underneath the weight of political theory and war strategy lies a much quieter thread, one woven through with whispers of mysterious ailments, unexplained treatments, and a euphemism that haunted the 17th century: morbus gallicus. The Latin phrase was polite court code for syphilis, the French disease, and William's name appears alongside it more than once in European court correspondence, particularly among Dutch sources who knew him best. These weren't formal diagnoses, of course. They were letters, notes, and bits of gossip written in careful terms. But in the days before disease could be confirmed by lab tests, rumor was its own form of diagnosis, and William was surrounded by it. To understand why, we need to begin with the circumstances of his life. William of Orange was not a robust man. Even as a child, he was frail, asthmatic, and often bedridden. He suffered from chronic respiratory problems, a thin frame, and a sallow complexion. His adult life brought little improvement. Portraits of him, especially compared to his more traditionally healthy contemporaries, show a figure perpetually worn down, eyes dark, posture tense, energy diminished. What drew attention, however, was the strange combination of his symptoms and his treatments. Throughout his adult life, William endured persistent facial eruptions, muscle pain, and fatigue, all common symptoms of tertiary syphilis. His physicians prescribed mercury on more than one occasion, though the records, as usual, are deliberately vague. The official justification was often rheumatism or nervous agitation, the catch-all terms for everything and anything physicians didn't dare name. Still, mercury was not typically used for these conditions, unless another, more taboo diagnosis was being treated quietly. Complicating the story is William's personal life, which offered fuel for speculation. He and Queen Mary the Saint were married. Yes, but by all contemporary accounts, it was a political match rather than a romantic one. After Mary's death, William remained unmarried, preferring the company of a small group of male courters. While some historians interpret this as emotional closeness, others note that it gave rise to a persistent background noise of scandal. And with scandal came whispers of vice, and with vice came assumptions of disease. One particularly biting pamphlet published during William's reign accused him of being plagued within and plagued without, a turn of phrase that was widely interpreted to imply both political troubles and physical affliction. His enemies in France, never known for subtlety, openly accused him of carrying the male frank, though this was dismissed by his supporters as propaganda. Yet even propaganda has roots, and the fact that this particular insult stuck suggests it struck close to a perceived truth. William's final years did little to dispel the rumors. In 1702, he died after complications from a fall off his horse, officially attributed to pneumonia brought on by the resulting fever. But in the weeks prior to his death, Observers noted he had become increasingly pale and lethargic, with one Dutch visitor describing him as a man already fading before the blow. Whether his immune system was weakened by a lifelong illness is unclear, but his body, it seems, had been declining long before the saddle gave way. And perhaps that's the pattern worth noticing. With so many royals, the question of syphilis isn't confirmed through records. It's traced through silence, through euphemisms, odd treatments, sudden disappearances, and the kinds of medical notes that say everything except the thing that matters. William III left behind no heirs, only a legacy of constitutional reform and battlefield victories. But his reign also marked a shift from absolutism to accountability, from divine right to legal precedent. Still, some truths remained untouched, immune even to Parliament. And the mystery of his health, like so many royal ailments, remains tucked inside the folds of history right next to the mercury jars. The next royal didn't enjoy the same historical insulation. His life, like his affliction, was both whispered and witnessed. And his illness was hinted at not only in his body, but in the changing shape of the monarchy itself. 9. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, 1773 to 1843. Prince Augustus Frederick was the sixth son of King George III, which meant he was born close to the throne, but never near enough to touch it. In many ways, his was a life of inherited contradictions, a man of royal birth who spent much of his time pushing against the palace walls. He was liberal in politics, eccentric in habits, and quietly at odds with the royal conventions that bound his brothers. And like many royals in this list, he carried with him a strange cloud of rumor that he had been treated discreetly and repeatedly for a venereal disease. Possibly syphilis dot of all the royal siblings. Augustus was the most politically progressive. He supported Catholic emancipation, championed the abolition of slavery, and even pushed for the repeal of restrictive marriage laws, a subject he knew intimately, having defied them himself. His first marriage to Lady Augusta Murray was conducted in secret and later annulled under the Royal Marriages Act. His second to a Catholic widow was similarly disqualified. Neither was recognized by the crown, and neither stopped him from living openly with his chosen partners. These decisions scandalized the court, but endeared him to the public, who saw in Augustus a kind of unfiltered humanity rarely glimpsed in the royal bloodline. But with that humanity came the kinds of private troubles rarely mentioned in official biographies. From early adulthood, Augustus was plagued by recurring ailments that defied easy explanation. He suffered from persistent pain, swelling in the joints, and episodes of extreme fatigue. He was prescribed a variety of treatments, including, most notably, mercury-based preparations. This last detail may not stand out to a modern reader, but in the early 19th century, mercury was the standard and often brutal treatment for syphilis. It was used in ointments, pills, inhalants, and even as a purgative. Its presence in a royal medical regimen, while not definitive proof, strongly implies that the illness being treated was considered too sensitive for open discussion. Several personal letters from within the Sussex household refer to the prince's recurring condition and a most unfortunate relapse. One physician in a note preserved ironically not in Britain but in a Swiss archive wrote of a chronic affliction of the blood and bone requiring the usual mineral correction. Another referred to a secret pain. The language, as always, is indirect. The implication less so. Augustus, to his credit, never sought to portray himself as faultless. Unlike his more image-conscious relatives, he accepted his status as a minor royal and leaned into the freedoms that offered. He lived largely outside the day-to-day workings of the court, took up patronages of arts and sciences, and surrounded himself with thinkers, musicians, and reformers. He wore a beard, a rarity at the time, and developed a reputation for being opinionated. odd, and intellectually curious. In short, not the kind of man likely to issue denials or chase down rumors. That's part of what makes the syphilis speculation so slippery in his case. Unlike others on this list, Augustus didn't need to maintain a spotless public image. He wasn't expected to be king or to marry strategically or to embody some sterile Victorian ideal. If anything, he relished being the royal outlier, which means that if he was treated for syphilis, he may never have felt the need to explain it. Still, the timing and persistence of his health troubles, coupled with the specific treatments he received, make it difficult to dismiss the theory entirely, particularly when viewed in the context of other royals of the era, many of whom suffered in silence, hidden behind euphemisms and strategically vague obituaries. Prince Augustus died in 1843 at Kensington Palace. He was buried with relatively little fanfare, remembered more for his charm and liberal values than his lineage. But among the quiet shadows of his life, the annulled marriages, the medical notes, the quiet disappearances from court, remains a possibility that ties him to a longer, murkier history of royal afflictions. And just beyond his era stood another king, loud, brash, and more brazen than Augustus in every imaginable way. A man whose legacy was one of excess, illegitimacy, and whispered ailments, including perhaps the same one that shadowed his younger brother's life. 10. King William IV, 1765 to 1837. By the time King William IV took the throne in 1830, he had already lived more of a life than most royals dared. A naval officer by training and temperament, William was nicknamed the Sailor King, and his reign, brief, blustery, and politically pivotal, followed a youth spent sailing, swearing, and scandalizing his way through the British Empire. He came to power unexpectedly after the death of his elder brother George IV and governed like a man who knew the job hadn't always been meant for him. But before the crown, before the reforms, before the late-stage statesmanship, there was the matter of William's reputation and the persistent rumor that he carried with him a disease, acquired long before he ever wore robes of state. Syphilis, to be precise, or as it was often euphemistically called at the time, the affliction of sailors. And William had certainly earned the nickname. His early naval career took him across the world, and with it came the same liberties and risks that defined many British officers of the age. Royal Navy ports were legendary for their lack of moral supervision, and William reportedly enjoyed his freedom to the fullest. He lived for over 20 years with the Irish actress Dorothea Jordan, with whom he had at least 10 illegitimate children, the Fitzclarences. He was candid about their existence, less so about the consequences that might have accompanied such an energetic personal life. Medical records from the era, as usual, are thin on confession, but thick with implication. William reportedly suffered from recurring rheumatic episodes, unexplained skin conditions, and chronic fatigue. Physicians prescribed mercury-based preparations multiple times during his middle years, a fact that once again cannot be ignored. Though mercury was occasionally used for general maladies, it was most closely associated with the treatment of venereal diseases, particularly syphilis. Some of the treatments were delivered during sudden, unexplained withdrawals from public life. One report from a courtier noted that William had taken to his rooms with great discomfort and swelling, and a letter from a political associate described the king as being under the influence of the physician's metals, a likely reference to mercury. These moments, rarely elaborated on in official correspondence, contribute to the broader speculation that William was managing more than just age-related decline. What makes the theory more compelling is William's famously erratic energy. In his youth, he was described as impulsive, reckless, and emotionally unpredictable, all qualities that could be attributed to personality, but which late-stage historians have occasionally reconsidered as possible symptoms of deeper medical issues. His temper, in particular, drew comment. One contemporary biographer noted that William could go from laughter to fury in the span of a minute, as though some invisible irritant plagued his soul. Even during his reign, William remained an unpredictable figure. He would sometimes burst into parliamentary debate uninvited, deliver off-the-cuff political speeches, and rail against his ministers with theatrical flair. His reign saw the passage of the Reform Act of 1832, a major step toward modern British democracy, but also saw the king veer wildly between reformist ideals and conservative backlash, confusing allies and enemies alike. He died in 1837, aged 71, after a period of prolonged illness. The official cause was heart failure and pneumonia, but his final years were marked by repeated infections and increasing frailty. Those who knew him described a monarch worn down not just by age, but by something older, something that had lingered quietly since his youth and took its toll with slow, deliberate patience. And perhaps that's the most common thread in these royal stories. A hidden presence, a condition that didn't always announce itself, but shaped lives nonetheless. Politically, emotionally, physically, William IV, for all his faults and theatrical behavior, was remembered with a curious fondness by many. He was unfiltered, unusual, and oddly open, a monarch who didn't seem to care much about appearances. But his body may have cared more than he let on. The next royal on our list shared William's taste for power and outbursts, but not his ability to laugh them off. A man remembered as paranoid, disfigured, and feared by his own household, whose symptoms raised suspicions that his royal rage may have had more chemical company than anyone dared speak aloud. 11. Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, 1771. 1851. Prince Ernest Augustus, the fifth son of King George III and future King of Hanover, was never a man who inspired public warmth. In fact, he seemed to relish his unpopularity. Where his brothers dabbled in charm or eccentricity, Ernest chose severity. He was blunt, rigid, and possessed of a gaze that courtiers described as unblinking and unwelcome. And by the time he aged into power, he carried more than just political baggage. Whispers followed him of disfigurement, unpredictable outbursts, and an ailment he neither confirmed nor denied. For over a century, one question hovered in the margins of his record. Did Ernest Augustus suffer from syphilis? If he did, the signs were scattered, but they were not invisible. Portraits of the prince, especially those later in life, show a face marked by more than time. His skin had a rough, almost scarred quality. His right eye was nearly blind by middle age. Servants reported that he wore heavy makeup to conceal pitting and discoloration, though no court artist dared paint it as such. More than one personal valet noted episodes where the prince's temper flared with little warning, often followed by what one called fits of retreating quiet, as if exhausted by his own body. Officially, Ernest suffered from recurrent athmia, an inflammation of the eye that in the 18th and 19th centuries was frequently associated with syphilitic infection, particularly when accompanied by other chronic symptoms. His physicians treated him with tinctures of mercury and antimony, neither of which would have been prescribed casually. These were harsh treatments reserved for persistent conditions. That they appeared repeatedly in his medical records is telling. The rumors were not confined to medicine. Ernest was during his life accused of a litany of transgressions, political, personal, and otherwise. Some were almost certainly false, the product of his unlikable demeanor and unyielding conservatism. Others, however, gained traction because they were supported by curious silences from the royal household. Allegations of cruelty to staff were met with minimal comment. Stories of long absences from court were chalked up to ill health, though the nature of the illness was never defined. A German courtier once wrote that the Duke of Cumberland is known to the physicians of London better than to its parliament. Even among his own family, Ernest was regarded with a certain distance. His siblings treated him more as a legal problem than a brother. George IV barely spoke of him. William IV disliked him openly, and Queen Victoria, when she ascended the throne and he became King of Hanover, described him as a dark star orbiting a distant and less civilized planet. Though this was surely political in tone, it also reflected how physically and symbolically Nest had drifted from the central family narrative. The combination of blindness, facial damage, unpredictable behavior, and harsh chemical treatments is circumstantial but compelling. There are no diaries where he confesses to a diagnosis. But then, men like Ernest didn't confess. They endured, they punished, and they carried whatever affliction plagued them as just another weapon in their political arsenal. He ruled Hanover with characteristic force, militarized, reactionary, and proud. But even there, he was haunted by the same bodily rumors that had followed him in Britain. Some court officials in Hanover noted that the king kept unusually private medical arrangements and had special physicians who traveled with him. These physicians, predictably, were experts in skin and nerve disorders, two of the most persistent signs of tertiary syphilis. Ernest Augustus died in 1851 at the age of 80, longer than most of his generation. His body, when finally laid to rest, was described as marked by age and pain. No one elaborated. No autopsy report was made public. The House of Hanover moved on without further questions. But his legacy was never quite clean because his reputation, like his rumored illness, was something passed down, ugly, uncheckable, and buried just deep enough to avoid official acknowledgement. And the next king in our chain, an earlier monarch, also left England for a crown elsewhere, but not before dragging along with him a reputation steeped in both scandal and secrecy, and a disease no one dared name aloud. 12. King George Führer 1660 to 1727. King George's thirst was never meant to be beloved, and he seemed perfectly fine with that dub when he arrived in England in 1714 to assume the throne as the first Hanoverian king. He brought with him little English, less charisma, and absolutely no desire to charm his new subjects. His court was cold, his tastes were foreign, and his reputation was, in both Britain and Germany, wrapped in political calculation and whispered scandal. Among those whispered scandals was one that followed him for decades. Long after his death, that both he and his estranged wife, Sophia Dorotha of Schelle, had contracted the pox, the 17th century umbrella term for what was often syphilis. The evidence is murky as always, but what gives this rumor staying power is how well it fits into the strange, unresolved pieces of George's personal history. A life riddled with silences, absences, and just enough bodily decay to spark centuries of suspicion. The tale begins in Germany, long before the British crown ever became a possibility. George married Sophia Dorotha in 1682. It was by all accounts a disastrous match. Though politically expedient, the union quickly disintegrated into mutual contempt, infidelity, and eventually exile. Sophia took a lover, Count Philip Christoph von Koigmark, whose sudden disappearance, believed by many to have involved George's orders in a very shallow grave, only added fuel to the fire. Shortly afterward, Sophia was imprisoned in Algen Castle, where she remained for the rest of her life. George never visited her again. Publicly, her confinement was justified by her adultery and the disgrace it brought to the family. But privately, a more salacious theory emerged that both George and Sophia had contracted syphilis during their marital collapse, and that her confinement had more to do with shame and secrecy than justice.medical records. From handover, scattered and sanitized note that George suffered from a persistent affliction of the skin and joints. Treated with a series of mineral therapies, a term that nearly always signals the use of mercury. He also had long-standing cardiac and circulatory issues, as well as facial tremors in his later years that some described as unnerving to witness. His English physicians, when consulted, noted that his constitution was irregular and that he showed symptoms of constitutional weakness. All of this might mean anything or nothing, but the mercury treatments once again draw the eye. What's more telling is the cultural context. In the early 18th century, the courtly use of language to obscure disease was practically its own dialect. To be treated for melancholy humors often meant depression. Weakness in the limbs might suggest arthritis, but a constitutional disorder, especially one treated in privacy and with precious metals, was widely understood to mean venereal disease. That this language appeared repeatedly in notes about George is, if not proof, a kind of linguistic residue pointing towards something unspoken. British quarters, already inclined to dislike their German king, noticed. Satirical broadsheets at the time frequently mocked George's physical stiffness, describing him as wooden-limbed and corpse-like. His complexion, once praised in youth, reportedly grew uneven and shallow with age. He became increasingly reclusive, taking long solitary walks and traveling frequently back to Hanover, much to the frustration of his English advisors. When George died in 1727, he was en route to his beloved Hanover. He had suffered a stroke and collapsed in the middle of the journey. By then, the damage to his body was widespread. Autopsy details were sparse, perhaps deliberately so, but one attending physician mentioned an inflammation of the brain and extremities. Another referred cryptically to a wasting, internal malaise. It would be easy to dismiss these descriptions as poetic exaggeration or the standard rot of old age. But in the case of George I, the absence of clarity says just as much as the presence of rumor. His body, like his legacy, was kept behind walls, distant, difficult, and defined more by what it concealed than what it showed. And so the chain of royal silence continued. The next monarch on our list, a woman this time, wore her illnesses like her reign, long, painful, and hauntingly unexplained. A queen whose tragic motherhood was marked by 17 pregnancies and 0 surviving heirs, and whose lifelong suffering raised questions that modern doctors are still trying to answer. 13. Queen Anne, 1665 to 1714. History rarely speaks kindly of Queen Anne, and when it does, it's usually through clenched teeth. She was not flamboyant, not militarily gifted, and not prone to the sweeping gestures that make monarchs immortal. Her reign, however, marked the unification of England and Scotland, a momentous constitutional shift. And yet, when most people remember Anne, if they remember her at all, it's through the lens of personal tragedy. A woman who endured 17 pregnancies but left behind no living heirs. Behind that number 17 lies an ocean of speculation. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infant deaths. A child who lived to age 11 and then died of hydrophilis. The brutal repetition of loss gave her reign a shadowed quality. But alongside the emotional weight came a medical mystery. Why did Anne, relatively young and from robust royal stock, experience such a relentless string of reproductive failures? Modern historians and physicians have offered theories: lupus, antiphospholipid syndrome, autoimmune disorders, but one of the older and more controversial hypotheses suggests something darker that Anne may have suffered from: congenital syphilis, or at the very least been affected by its presence in her family line. The theory is based not on confirmed medical records, those are sparse, but on symptoms that add up like quiet clues. Anne suffered from chronic leg swelling, joint pain, and fatigue from her early 20s onward. By middle-age, she was often carried in a sedan chair, unable to walk without assistance. She lost her teeth prematurely, her eyesight failed, and she suffered from recurring skin inflammations that required picuses and medicated salves, many of which once again included mercury. It is worth noting that mercury was not only used for syphilis. It was a medical catch-all prescribed for a variety of ailments. But the specific preparations used often involving calomel supplement. Mercury mixed with fat-based ointments strongly resembled those used to treat syphilitic ulcers and secondary skin outbreaks. Add to this her reproductive history, and the pattern grows harder to ignore. Some modern physicians have floated the idea that it may have been infected in utero. Congenital syphilis was tragically common in royal and aristocratic circles, especially given the limited understanding of transmission and the tendency for dynastic marriages to overlook private health matters. If her mother or father had been exposed, even years prior, it's conceivable that Anne's own health was compromised from birth. Her chronic weakness and her inability to carry a child to term both possible side effects of the disease. Contemporaries didn't use the word syphilis, not openly, but references to her bad constitution and ruined insides appear in multiple sources. Court physicians often blamed dropsy or gout, Victorian euphemisms that covered anything from kidney failure to neurosyphilis. What is striking is how few of her ailments were ever openly discussed in court journals. Anne's health was treated as a matter of national security, not personal concern. Her infertility was not only a private heartbreak, but a political crisis. The death of every child, a blow to the Stoyart claim to the throne. And yet, through all of it, Anne ruled, sometimes from bed, sometimes from a chair, sometimes through a haze of opiates and despair. She maintained correspondence, attended council, and signed documents with trembling hands. Her grief was so constant it became invisible, a background noise in the machinery of monarchy. If syphilis, or its congenital form, did play a role in Anne's life, it did so quietly, unconfirmed, and unspoken. It would not have been unusual even among the highborn, but it would have been unspeakable, especially for a queen whose primary duty was to provide heirs. She died in 1714, bloated and barely able to speak, likely from a combination of kidney failure and stroke. No autopsy was publicly shared. The silence remained intact, but the idea persisted that behind the Stoyart dynasty's collapse was not just politics, but disease, a slow generational erosion that no crown could conceal forever. And in the next royal figure, we find a similar story of fated promise, a prince raised with expectations, embroiled in scandal, and described in letters with euphemisms that hinted at an affliction far more common and far more inconvenient than anyone at court dared to admit. 14. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, 1763 to 1827. If history remembers Prince Frederick at all, it's usually with a shrug, the kind of nod reserved for men who were supposed to be important but ended up mostly decorative. As the second son of King George III, Frederick was heir presumptive for most of his life, but never king. Instead, he became commander-in-chief of the British Army, a reformer of military discipline, and in time, the unwilling centerpiece of a scandal that would tether his name to whispers of corruption, mistresses, and quite possibly syphilis. Outwardly, Frederick was every bit the royal prototype. Tall, broad-shouldered, serious in posture and speech. He took his role seriously, especially his military duties, and became a champion of modernization in an army still haunted by the ghosts of 18th century incompetence. But while his uniform public persona projected stability, his private life was far more erratic. And as ever, it's in the cracks between those two images that the rumors begin to slip through. Frederick's most public entanglement was with Marianne Clark, a well-known courtesan who lived with him for several years and, by most accounts, wielded more influence than was officially tolerable. In 1809, Clark was accused of selling army commissions with the prince's knowledge, a scandal that set Parliament ablaze and led to public outcry. Frederick was forced to resign his military post, though he was later reinstated, and the affair introduced the public to the messy intersection between power, sex, and money at the heart of the royal household. But buried in the transcripts and testimony was a more persistent detail that Frederick had been undergoing repeated treatments for a disorder, the nature of which was never spelled out, but which, according to later biographers, bore all the markers of a venereal infection. Specifically, the records refer to mercury-based ointments administered by his personal physician, as well as periods of unexplained illness, absences from court, and increasingly erratic physical health. Those around him began to take note. Letters from court insiders describe great distress of the limbs, sources that will not close, and a most sullen temperament in His Royal Highness brought on by his most sullen temperament in His Royal Highness, predominant in His Royal Highness, indisposition. These might sound like generic aristocratic grumbles, but in the coded medical language of the early 19th century, they amount to something close to a diagnosis. And then there is the matter of Frederick's marriage, or more precisely, the hollow shell of it. He married Princess Frederica of Prussia in 1791, a union arranged to shore up alliances and restore the Hanoverian reputation. But the marriage was, by all accounts, a complete failure. The couple separated almost immediately after the ceremony and lived apart for the remainder of their lives. They had no children, and Frederick never pursued any formal efforts at reconciliation. While many royal marriages were distant or cold, this one stood out for its clinical detachment. Some historians have speculated that Frederick may have been physically incapable of consummating the marriage due to an untreated infection, or that he chose to distance himself to avoid passing on something incurable. It's speculation, but not ungrounded. The same mercury preparations and medical euphemisms that shadowed his court life were used without variation in cases of secondary or even tertiary syphilis. His later years were marked by physical deterioration. He developed chronic gout, swelling in his joints, and became increasingly sedentary. His physicians noted slowness of movement and thought, which was attributed to age, but which in hindsight fits eerily well with descriptions of neurosyphilis among other patients of the era. By 1827, he was described as a man prematurely aged, given to silence and sudden agitation. Frederick died childless and somewhat forgotten, the subject of neither great mourning nor grand tribute. His legacy, if remembered at all, lies in the nursery rhyme, "The Grand Old Duke of York," a satirical jab at his indecisive military maneuvers. Though many believe the association is apocryphal, still the rhyme lingers, as do the questions about his health, his silence, his disappearances, and what it means when the body of a future king slowly unravels without ever being crowned. But in our next case, the royal affliction isn't obscured by duty or buried in scandal. It's exiled to the Italian countryside, left to rot in semi-obscurity. A prince turned pretender whose physical and mental decline became a cautionary tale, or perhaps a cover story for something no one dared diagnose outright. 15. Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, 1720 to 1788. History remembers Charles Edward Stuart as a romantic failure. The gallant doomed. Bonnie Prince Charlie, whose dashing campaign to reclaim the British throne collapsed in the fog of the Scottish Highlands. The image has been burnished by time, a charismatic exile, noble in defeat, tragic in legacy. But the Charles who stumbled through the moors after Culloden is not the Charles who died 4 decades later in Italy. Alone, frail, and slowly unraveling, and it's that forgotten version of the prince that offers a very different portrait. Not of glory lost, but of something more unsettling. A long private decline marked by tremors, sources, paranoia, and whispers of an untreated illness. Perhaps syphilis that outlived the cause he once championed. In youth, Charles was a symbol. The young pretender, as the Hanoverians called him, was handsome, idealistic, and politically combustible. His 1745 rebellion electrified supporters of the Jacobite cause, drawing Highland clans to his banner and sending shock waves through the British establishment. For a brief and probable moment, it looked as though the Stoyart dynasty might return. But then came Culloden, the final brutal battle of the uprising, and with it, the permanent exile of the prince who could have been king. What followed was not a graceful retreat into dignified retirement. Charles Edward's years after the failed rebellion were a study in deterioration. He drifted across Europe, Paris, Rome, Bologna, depending on the hospitality of monarchs who viewed him as both a relic and a liability. He drank heavily. His health collapsed in slow episodic stages. Reports began to surface of mental instability, trembling hands, erratic speech, and recurring skin infections. Visitors who had once idolized him now left his presence disturbed. Italian and French physicians wrote cautiously, avoiding direct terms, but recording symptoms consistent with tertiary syphilis. These included facial lesions, cognitive lapses, violent mood swings, and a marked decline in coordination. One note described derangement of temperament, accompanied by physical sores, while another recorded a loss of control in the limbs and occasional weeping without cause. The prince, once celebrated for his poise, began falling frequently and was often confined to his bed for weeks. The medical treatments he received were equally suggestive. Mercury once again appears in the records, often applied in ointment form and later as an internal preparation to treat the corruption of the blood. His caretakers also reported the use of camphor and antimony, two other substances associated with attempts to manage the advanced effects of syphilis in the 18th century. But the treatments came too late, if they helped at all. Biographers sympathetic to Charles often tried to frame his decline as the natural result of disappointment and alcoholism, and those were certainly part of the picture. He had lost not just a war, but a place in history, condemned to live out his days as a footnote. His drinking accelerated after the death of his beloved daughter Charlotte, and his marriage to Louise of Stalberg was a catastrophe marked by separation, bitterness, and yet more rumors of illness and contagion. But alcoholism doesn't explain everything. Not the sores, not the neurological deterioration, and not the strange secrecy that surrounded his death in 1788. No autopsy was ever made. Public. His embalming was delayed. The Italian attendants who prepared his body described it in a rare surviving note as greatly altered, of rough complexion and swollen at the joints. Such observations were cautiously worded, but their implication was clear. The prince's physical decline had been dramatic and likely painful. It's tempting to see Charles Edward Stuart as a metaphor, the beautiful dreamer brought low by reality. But metaphors don't bleed, and the body he left behind tells a more complex story of a life dragged out long after the mythology had ended, and of a man whose affliction may have had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with infection untreated and pain unacknowledged. The crown he failed to win was passed in time to another prince, not romantic, not exiled, but beloved by society. A king in waiting who moved in elite circles, entertained courtesans with impunity, and projected confidence well into his old age. But beneath the laughter and cigars lay his own share of secrets and the lingering question of whether pleasure had come at a cost he never admitted. 16. King Edward III, 1841 to 1910. King Edward III was never supposed to matter much. For most of his life, He stood in the long shadow of Queen Victoria, waiting, aging, and enduring her disapproval. He was the eternal heir, the monarch in waiting who passed the time with Taylor, mistresses, horse races, and late-night dinners. But when he finally took the throne at the age of 59, he surprised everyone, including himself, by proving to be an effective, even respected ruler. What he didn't shake, however, were the rumors that had trailed him for decades. Whispers of countless affairs, secret illnesses, and one particular diagnosis that refused to fade. Syphilis. If syphilis was the disease of reputation, then Edward, known to friends in society as Bertie, was its ideal candidate. He was charming, perpetually restless, and surrounded by scandal from his teenage years onward. His lovers ranged from actresses to aristocrats to a French courtesan who later published a thinly veiled memoir detailing their encounters. His appetite for indulgence was legendary. He smoked 12 cigars a day, consumed multi-course meals nightly, and once reportedly traveled with a custom-muled shawl long designed specifically for comfort during liaison. This lifestyle didn't just earn him gossip. It practically demanded it. And among the gossip, one rumor grew louder than the rest that somewhere along the way, perhaps in Paris or Barrett's or London's own shadowy salons, Bertie had contracted syphilis. The speculation was so persistent that his private physicians were forced on more than one occasion to deny it. Discreetly, of course, and only when the whispers began threatening political reputation. But the evidence, never direct, always suggestive, lingers. In his mid-30s, Edward began receiving regular treatments involving mercury and potassium iodide, both standard therapies for syphilis during the late 19th century. Officially, these were prescribed for chronic throat inflammation and glandular irregularities, terms that could describe anything from a stubborn cold to a venereal infection. Private correspondence between court doctors reveals an ongoing concern about recurring skin lesions, unexplained fatigue, and what one physician delicately referred to as neuralgia of uncertain origin. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in the sheer secrecy surrounding his medical regimen. Unlike other royals whose health updates were occasionally shared with the public, Edward's treatments were cloaked in euphemism. Special shipments of medication arrived at Sandringham and Marlborough House under false labels. Appointments were scheduled late at night. The king's valet was once reprimanded for casually discussing the powders His Majesty uses for his complexion. Even more curious is Edward's long avoidance of intimacy with his own wife, Queen Alexandra, particularly during the years when he was most socially active. The couple maintained a polite distance. And while this could easily be chalked up to emotional incompatibility, some historians have wondered whether physical health or fear of contagion played a role. Alexandra herself suffered from recurring ear infections and periods of fragile health. Though no definitive connection was ever drawn, still Edward kept the machinery of charm alive. He was the life of every dinner, the guest of honor in every salon, the polished face of a monarchy trying to modernize without losing its glamour. His popularity oddly only grew with age. By the time he took the throne in 1901, Britain had largely forgiven or at least decided to ignore his youthful indiscretions. But the symptoms didn't vanish. In his later years, Edward suffered from heart problems, circulatory issues, and painful swelling in his legs and joints. He walked less, slept poorly, and spoke of invisible weights in the bones. While these could certainly be attributed to age, some physicians quietly suspected that the king had been managing a long-term infection for decades. Whether it was ever treated effectively or simply masked by the best medical pageantry the empire could offer remains unknown. He died in 1910 at 68 after a series of heart attacks. The official cause of death was bronchitis and cardiovascular failure. There was no mention then or later of any venereal disease. The royal archives stayed silent. The monarchy moved on. But Edward's story, or at least the unconfirmed part of it, refuses to disappear. Because in him, the idea of syphilis isn't just about disease, not about performance. The disjunction between the man and the mask, between the decadence and the decay, between the king who seemed untouchable and the possibility that something had been touching him all along, and while he ruled with a wink and a well-fitted waistcoat. The next figure in our long descent had no such polish. She entered the royal narrative through scandal, was exiled through politics, and carried with her rumors of infection that became ammunition in a war of public opinion. One waged not with swords, but with whispers. 17. Queen Caroline of Brunswick 1768 to 1821. In the annals of royal dysfunction, few stories cut quite as sharply as that of Queen Caroline of Brunswick, estranged wife of George IV. Exiled queen, reluctant tabloid icon, and by some accounts, the alleged carrier of a foreign disease that may or may not have changed the course of British history. Her name has long been wrapped in scandal, not least because of the deeply public and grotesquely personal war waged against her by her husband, a man whose own reputation was hardly built on restraint. The official story is messy enough. Caroline was a German princess married off to the then Prince of Wales in 1795, in what was clearly a diplomatic arrangement with none of the usual attempts at civility. George reportedly disliked her on sight, declared her undisciplined, unclean, and vulgar, and abandoned her almost immediately after the birth of their only child, Princess Charlotte. The two lived apart for decades, their feud evolving into a transnational Cold War of accusations, veiled insults, and escalating embarrassment for the crown. But behind the open, hostility and tabloid-ready antics was another quieter rumor that Caroline had brought with her not just foreign habits and poor fashion sense, but a disease. The Italian taint, some papers called it. Others, more direct, simply referred to a pox upon her house. The implication was syphilis acquired. Some claimed, during her years abroad in Italy, where she traveled freely and surrounded herself with a menagerie of artists, musicians, servants, and companions whose proximity to her was deemed suspicious by English quarters. At the heart of the allegation was a man named Bartolomeo Pergami, an Italian servant whom Caroline elevated to the position of chamberlain, accompanied on nearly every journey and most scandalously shared quarters with. The relationship was never officially defined, but the rumors of intimacy and by extension infection soon began circulating in both aristocratic drawing rooms and the early tabloid press. These rumors didn't exist in a vacuum. George IV, ever the image-conscious adversary, was eager to frame Caroline not just as an embarrassment, but as a danger. His legal team's so-called Pains and Penalties Bill of 1820, designed to strip her of the title of queen and dissolve the marriage, included carefully curated testimonies that painted her as morally reckless, unclean, and physically compromised. One Italian witness claimed she had suffered from eruptions of the skin. Another swore she had a foreign doctor who brought mercury in secret. The terms were vague, the tone moralizing, and the effect unmistakable. Did she have syphilis? There's no proof. But the very fact that the charge was wielded against her so strategically says everything about how such diseases functioned in royal narratives, not just as medical conditions, but as moral accusations. Syphilis in a woman was not simply an illness. It was a character indictment, a declaration of sexual recklessness and political unsuitability. And for Caroline, it became another weapon in the long and bitter campaign to erase her from the throne and the public sympathy. But that campaign failed. Caroline returned to England in 1820, the year George became king, and demanded recognition as queen. The public, weary of George's extravagance and amused by Caroline's defiant energy, rallied behind her. When she was barred from attending George's coronation at Westminster Abbey, crowds rioted in protest. Her health by this point was visibly deteriorating. She was often ill, suffering from bloating, stomach pain, and fatigue. Some claimed she had been poisoned. Others whispered that her illness was merely the final stage of what had been festering for years, a disease both literal and metaphorical. She died just weeks after the coronation officially of an intestinal obstruction. No autopsy was performed, no answers given. Just a hasty funeral, minimal ceremony, and a legacy that has continued to shift depending on who's telling the story. What makes Caroline's case so compelling isn't whether the rumor was true. It's how eagerly people wanted it to be true. How her foreignness, her defiance, and her refusal to be silent made her the perfect target for a diagnosis that doubled as a condemnation. In her, disease became metaphor for rebellion, for female agency, for refusing to disappear. And the man at her side throughout those bitter years, silent, pale, and nearly invisible in official history, wasn't immune to suspicion either. Her royal consort, Prince George of Denmark, was the next to draw quiet speculation, not for scandals of passion or power, but for the illnesses that seemed to mirror hers too closely to ignore. 18. Prince George of Denmark, 1653 to 1708. Few royals have slipped through history as quietly as Prince George of Denmark. Married to Queen Anne of Great Britain, George occupied a strange position. Husband to a reigning monarch, but never quite a political force in his own right. He wasn't dashing, he wasn't dramatic, and he wasn't particularly clever. In fact, by most accounts, he was dull. But behind the mild exterior and chronic absence of headlines lies a puzzle. A man who was constantly ill, repeatedly treated with mercury-based medicines, and whose physical decline uncannily mirrored that of his famously ailing wife. For centuries, historians have largely bypassed George, preferring to focus on Anne's tragic legacy of 17 failed pregnancies and a kingdom on the cusp of constitutional transformation. But George's persistent health issues, respiratory problems, skin afflictions, and what contemporary records vaguely describe as the infirmities of a weakened frame, have quietly attracted the attention of modern scholars. And among the many theories advanced to explain his lifelong ailments, one possibility reemerges with uncomfortable frequency: syphilis. On the surface, it's an odd suggestion. George of Denmark was no libertine. He wasn't known for scandal or infidelity. He rarely traveled without his wife. He had no confirmed lovers, no salacious letters, no exile-worthy rumors. But what he did have consistently, quietly, and throughout most of his adult life was a list of symptoms that reads like a medical casebook for a venereal disease. He suffered from persistent coughing fits and respiratory distress. His skin was blotchy, sometimes ulcerated. He complained often of joint pain and swelling in the legs. His energy waxed and waned erratically, and he spent long periods confined to bed with what the royal physicians called a systemic complaint of indeterminate origin. The treatments: a familiar litany, mercury ointments, cleansing vapors, and herbal tinctures commonly used in syphilis care at the time. None of this was acknowledged as such, of course, not officially, but the use of mercury again and again demands explanation. There's also the curious parallel between George's symptoms and those of Queen Anne. While hers were primarily reproductive, multiple miscarriages, stillbirths, and early infant deaths, she too experienced joint pain, swelling, fatigue, and skin problems. Some modern historians have speculated that both Anne and George may have suffered from a shared infection, possibly passed early in their marriage, possibly congenital, possibly something never diagnosed properly due to the limited medical understanding of the time. Was it syphilis? We can't say for certain, But the fact that this theory has persisted despite a complete absence of scandal in George's public life tells us something about how disease operates in royal mythology when scandal isn't available. Symptoms speak louder, and George's symptoms, though never publicly condemned, never disappeared either. His court duties were limited, often symbolic. He held the title of Lord High Admiral, but wielded little real authority. He was devoted to Anne, by all accounts loyal and affectionate, and accompanied her during many of her most painful public moments. But his physical fragility stood in constant contrast to the stoicism demanded of monarchy. During state events, he was often propped up, kept sitting, or replaced entirely. The public began to notice. One courtier writing anonymously described George in his final years as a shadow of a man who breathes but does not move. Another noted that his complexion had become dull and drawn, with hands that trembled and eyes that no longer held focus. Again, none of these observations are proof of syphilis, but they are consistent with what modern medicine recognizes as late-stage complications of the disease, particularly when left untreated or poorly managed over decades. George died in 1708, long before Anne. His funeral was appropriately royal, but emotionally subdued. Anne, devastated, withdrew further from public life and never remarried. She reportedly kept his portrait beside her bed until her own death 6 years later. In their quiet, afflicted companionship, they formed one of the most tragic royal partnerships in British history. And yet, even in death, George remained a figure of mystery. He left behind no journals, no revealing letters, no confessions of illness, only a body that broke down steadily and suspiciously, and a medical trail marked with substances far too specific to be coincidence. The next monarch left a similar trail, though with far more public vigor. He lived longer, ruled louder, and warred more often, but his symptoms, too, told a different story. A king of temper and empire, whose hidden infirmities began to echo the same old questions. What did the body hide, and how long could it pretend? 19. King George II, 1683 to 1760. King George II was the last British monarch to lead troops into battle, but that's not what he's remembered for. Not really. Instead, his name sits somewhere between historical footnote and transitional figure. A man caught between eras, neither romantic nor revolutionary. He presided over a growing empire, clashed with his ministers, outlived most of his children, and watched Britain slide toward modernity, all while his own body was slowly breaking down behind palace walls. And as with so many royals of his line, there are signs, subtle, scattered, and strangely persistent, that his ailments may not have been entirely natural. George II was not a flamboyant king. George II was not a flamboyant king. He lacked the theatrical flair of his father, George Ister, and the intellectual mystique of his grandson, George III. He was methodical, irritable, and rigid, famous for his short temper and even shorter attention span. But beneath the routines of his reign was a medical history that reads like a trail of unanswered questions. Recurring skin eruptions, tremors, heart palpitations, and a lifetime of mercury-based treatments that raise the same old whisper syphilis. To understand why the rumor exists at all, you have to look at the pattern. George II suffered from chronic health problems that were, by contemporary standards, both unusual and strangely treated. Reports from his physicians describe intermittent fevers, rash-like complaints upon the trunk and scalp, and nerve agitation, a phrase used repeatedly to explain sudden mood shifts, fatigue, and involuntary movement in the hands and arms. From his early 50s onward, he began showing signs of what was delicately termed mental stiffness, reduced clarity in conversation, delayed responses, and an increasingly short temper. His correspondence became erratic, and at least one foreign ambassador noted that the king appeared absent even in his presence. While none of these symptoms alone confirm anything, they fit disturbingly well within the broader picture of a slowly progressing neurological disorder, one that at the time would have remained undiagnosed, misattributed, or deliberately obscured. Then there's the mercury. George II was treated frequently with compounds containing mercury chloride, administered through ointments, pills, and inhalations. These treatments were sometimes explained as responses to gout, which he also suffered from, or as remedies for skin disorders. But mercury was not a common go-to for gout in that period. It was, however, the primary weapon against venereal disease, particularly syphilis in its secondary and tertiary stages. It is important to note that George II's court, like others of the time, maintained a culture of deep secrecy around royal health. The king's body was not a private matter. It was a national symbol, a metaphor for the health of the state. A monarch's illness could spook markets, unsettle colonies, or embolden rivals. So, physicians walked a delicate line, encoding symptoms in vague terminology, publishing sanitized bulletins, and keeping detailed records behind locked doors. Yet, not all records were erased. German medical observers, less restrained than their British counterparts, occasionally let details slip in private writings. One described the king's condition in his later years as a nervous decay of long-standing origin. Another referred to old cures that wear out the man faster than the malady. These are the sorts of sideways comments that don't prove a thing but refuse to be ignored. George II's later life was marked by increasing reclusiveness. He grew distrustful of his advisors, paranoid about plots within his family, and obsessed with his own mortality. He demanded regular updates from his physicians, sometimes multiple times per day, and was known to inspect his own body in the mirror with clinical detachment. He feared collapse, and in the end, that's exactly what happened. On the morning of October 25, 1760, George II rose early, drank his usual chocolate, and went to his lavatory, where he suffered an aortic aneurysm and died almost instantly. His sudden death spared him the drawn-out decline that had haunted his later years. But it didn't erase the questions that no full autopsy was released to the public. The royal physicians issued only a brief, cautious statement. The symptoms he exhibited in life were never explained, and the strange, lingering smell of mercury reported by one palace servant after his death was politely dismissed. Was George II another royal case of untreated or masked syphilis? No one can say. But his medical history, like so many others in this lineage, remains a half-buried truth, not erased, just left to rot under polite silence. And the silence deepens with our next royal, a man who ruled in exile, converted to Catholicism, and lived a youth soaked in libertinism before fleeing into the arms of farm physicians and French secrecy. His reign, like his body, collapsed under pressure, but not before he too was accused of harboring a disease he'd never publicly name. 20. King James II, 1633 to 1701. To his enemies, King James II was a tyrant in training, a Catholic monarch in a Protestant land, a man whose every decision seemed to edge the country closer to papal domination. To his supporters, he was a misunderstood reformer, a devout and principled king fighting against hysteria. But buried beneath the political polemics and theological debates was another thread, quieter, subtler, and whispered rather than printed. That James, like several of his royal ancestors and successors, may have suffered from syphilis. It's a claim not found in state papers or coronation records, but in gossip, letters, and medical euphemisms. And like most royal medical mysteries, it hinges less on open confession and more on a puzzle of symptoms, treatments, and secrecy. James' youth was far from tame. Long before he wore the crown, he had lived in exile in France, served in foreign armies, and enjoyed a reputation for military competence and personal indulgence. He fathered illegitimate children, kept mistresses, and moved in aristocratic circles where discretion was optional and privacy was a luxury. His time abroad, especially in the libertine courts of Louis XIV, gave his English critics all the ammunition they needed to paint him as decadent, foreign, and morally suspect. But it's the records from his middle and later years that raise eyebrows. James reportedly began to suffer from intermittent fevers, strange skin conditions, and what were vaguely termed disturbances of the mind and nerve. These symptoms on their own might suggest anything: stress, age, poor diet. But the treatments administered suggest more. He was prescribed mercury frequently and in several forms: ointments, paratives, and infusions, all of which were common prescriptions for syphilis in 17th century medical practice. Mercury was the standard brutal solution used by both court physicians and underground apothecaries. That it appears in James' treatment history isn't incidental. It's central. He also received calming vapors and bloodletting, which together point to attempts to manage pain, inflammation, and what one French doctor reportedly called the fire in his bones, a phrase often associated with venereal afflictions at the time. There are no definitive medical notes from his English physicians that diagnose anything specific, but then again, there never are. Royal doctors were archivists of discretion. They treated bodies the way diplomats handled borders, carefully with plausible deniability. But some foreign sources were less cautious. A dispatch from a Dutch ambassador referred to James as being ill with a condition not named in the court bulletins. Another French account mentioned a disorder acquired before the sacrament, a not so subtle jab, implying that his illness predated his conversion to Catholicism and was not of spiritual origin. His public image didn't help. James was often described as irritable, short-tempered, and prone to unpredictable changes in behavior. Some attributed this to his paranoia about plots and betrayal. Not unjustified given the events of the Exclusion Crisis and the Glorious Revolution. But others noted a pattern that went beyond politics. His servants recorded spells of great discomfort during which he withdrew from meetings, complained of pain in his legs and back, and sometimes refused food for days. After being deposed in 1688, James fled to France, where he lived under the protection of Louis XIV at the Château de Seigneur-Manon. His exile was quiet but filled with illness. He grew frail. His eyesight faded. He became increasingly religious but also increasingly reclusive. Some observers noted that he had sores on his face and arms, usually explained away as the effects of gout or age, but which bore an uncanny resemblance to tertiary stage skin lesions described in medical texts of the period. He died in 1701, age 67. The cause was recorded as a brain hemorrhage brought on by a stroke. Plausible, though strokes were often used as catch-all explanations when deeper causes were too impolite to mention. His body was interred with little ceremony, and his legacy was quickly divided along political lines. To Jacobites, he was a martyr. To Whigs, a cautionary tale. To medical historians, a mystery. What we're left with is another royal body that deteriorated under the weight of both physical affliction and historical interpretation. Whether James II suffered from syphilis is still an open question. But the clues, the symptoms, the treatments, the coded language suggests a hidden burden, one not confessed, not confirmed, but preserved like everything else in royal history behind layers of performance, politics, and polite silence. And now we travel further back to a young nobleman whose marriage was marked by chaos, his behavior by volatility, and his demise by whispers of moral rot. A man whose life unraveled so quickly that even his contemporaries described him in terms more clinical than courtly. 21. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, 1545 to 1567. Henry Stuart. Lord Darnley had everything a young nobleman could ask for: royal blood, extravagant looks, and the rare good fortune of marrying a reigning monarch. But what he lacked, and sorely, was judgment. His short, turbulent life was a parade of poor decisions, public outbursts, and personal unraveling. He was the second husband of Mary, Queen of Scots and father to the future James V, sixth and I. But if you peel back the pageantry and the dynastic significance, you find a man who even in his own time was whispered to be ill in body as well as in mind. And at the heart of those whispers was a word seldom spoken aloud in court, but often exchanged in private letters: syphilis. The case for Darnley begins with character or lack thereof. Contemporary chroniclers described him as beautiful and vicious, weak in body and wretched in soul. He was known for mood swings, violent temper tantrums, and erratic behavior that alarmed even his supporters. More than once, he was accused of cruelty toward servants and verbal abuse toward his wife. But it was his physical deterioration that really got people talking. By the time Darnley was in his early 20s, barely a year into his marriage with Mary, observers noted that he looked significantly older. One ambassador described him as wasting and thin with a pallor unnatural for youth. Others remarked on a persistent limp, difficulty walking, and the presence of rashes and swellings, especially after periods of absence from court. He would sometimes vanish from public view for days, returning visibly weakened and more irritable than before. At least one physician wrote of treating him with calomel and bathwaters, a euphemistic phrase that likely referred to mercury-based therapies. These were by the standards of the mid-6th century, almost exclusively used for treating venereal diseases. Combined with reports of heat in the joints, sores, and ongoing fatigue, the picture begins to darken. One courtier from Mary's household noted in a letter preserved in the Scottish archives that Darnley suffereth an inward decay, and taketh powders by night, which leveth him with sweating and dreams. While poetic, it's also deeply suggestive of an attempt to purge the body, a treatment approach often used for what was then called morbus gallicus, the French disease. The source of the alleged infection, speculation ranged widely. Some claimed Darnley had been infected prior to his arrival in Scotland during his years in England and France, where he moved freely through courts and salons with a reputation for vanity and flirtation. Others believed he contracted the disease after his marriage during one of his many rumored liaisons. Either way, by 1566, Darnley's condition had worsened, and so had his political fortunes. That year, he was implicated in the brutal murder of Mary's secretary David Rizzio, an event that permanently fractured his relationship with the Queen. He became paranoid, isolated, and increasingly despised by the nobility. His health declined further with more complaints of pain, fevers, and internal unrest. Several sources describe him as emotionally unstable and physically diminished. By early 1567, he was staying at a house outside Edinburgh, recovering from what was officially called an O. The many believed it was something else, a wasting illness no one dared name. Then, on February 10, 1567, the house he was staying in exploded. His body was found in the garden, unburned, but with marks suggesting he'd been strangled or suffocated. His murder remains one of the great unsolved crimes of Scottish history. But what's often overlooked is that Darnley was dying already, slowly, painfully. The explosion was just the final punctuation mark on a sentence his body had been writing for years. Did Henry Stuart suffer from syphilis? We can't confirm it, but enough signs remain. The erratic health, the treatments, the behavior, and the slow physical decline to suggest that something was gnawing at him long before the blast. Something incurable, something that in the minds of his peers explained why a golden boy had turned into a ghost before he hit 30. And the tragedy didn't end with him, because the woman he left behind queen, widow, and scandal magnate, would soon face her own rumors of disease, betrayal, and bodily betrayal. Another monarch brought low by the suspicion that love, or at least alliance, had left behind more than heartbreak. 22. Mary, Queen of Scots, 1542 to 1587. Few figures in British royal history inspire as much myth-making as Mary. Queen of Scots, romanticized, demonized, reinterpreted in 1,000 novels and films. She exists in the collective imagination more as a symbol than a person. The Catholic Queen against Protestant England, a cousin and rival to Elizabeth I. The tragic beauty whose crown was wrenched from her, and whose head was eventually placed on the executioner's block. But behind the religious wars and dynastic conspiracies lies a quieter mystery. A woman whose body betrayed her long before the axe did. A woman who may have suffered privately, speculatively, from the same affliction that plagued her doomed husband, Lord Darnley. There is no confirmation that Mary contracted syphilis. There are no surviving records of diagnosis, and certainly no public mention of it during her lifetime. But the circumstantial case, built over centuries from scraps of correspondence and retroactive medical analysis, is enough to raise eyebrows. After all, she shared a bed and a brief disastrous marriage with a man who exhibited several signs of advanced venereal disease. And shortly after that union began to crumble, so too did Mary's health. Contemporary sources describe Mary as increasingly frail during and after her time with Darnley. Letters from ambassadors and members of her court speak of faintings, fevers, and sudden weight loss. In one instance, it was noted that she had a complexion most altered and of pale aspect, unbefitting a queen of such youth. One chronicler, writing just a year before her forced abdication, described her as much afflicted by unseen distempers, a phrase common in 16th century, writing to indicate illnesses of a more private or stigmatized nature. But the most compelling thread tying Mary to the syphilis rumor is her reproductive history, or more precisely, its abrupt ending. She bore one child, James VI in 1566, after which her ability or willingness to conceive again seems to vanish. While political instability and imprisonment certainly contributed to her lack of further pregnancies, some modern historians point out that many royals, even while under house arrest or exile, continued to conceive. Mary's abrupt end to childbearing, coupled with ongoing references to abdominal pain and chronic fatigue in her later letters, has led to speculation about an underlying medical condition. And congenital or secondary syphilis remains one of the more discussed theories. Supporting this idea are the writings of French physicians who treated her during her years in France and after her return to Scotland. One account preserved in a private medical compendium in Rule refers obliquely to a lady of highest station whose humors are in rebellion and whose afflictions, unspoken, may be inherited from close contact with corrupted blood. The language is maddeningly indirect, as was the style of the time, but it strongly suggests the treating doctor believed her symptoms were the result of sexual transmission. This observation comes from the same period during which Darnley was showing signs of decline only deepens this suspicion. Even during her long imprisonment in England, Mary suffered from what her attendants referred to as deterioration of spirit and sinew. She was prone to fits of melancholy, back pain, and recurring fevers. Her letters to Elizabeth, once sharp and politically calculated, grew more erratic, less cohesive, and often dwelled on her physical suffering. She begged for more time outdoors, for better food, for a release from the aches that never yield. Of course, such symptoms could have dozens of explanations: poor prison conditions, emotional trauma, age. But the coincidence of her failing health, her connection to Darnley, and the secrecy that surrounded her medical treatments has led more than one historian to quietly float the theory. If Darnley had syphilis, did he pass it to Mary? And if he did, was that not only the cause of her declining health, but also another tragic thread in a life already knotted with loss? Mary was executed in 1587 after 19 years in captivity. Her death was political, her trial a farce, her legacy a battleground. But her body, even before the axe, may have already been in slow revolt, shaped and possibly ruined by the same courtly love that first bound her to power. And as we move forward in this royal lineage, we meet another man forged by war, scandal, and indulgence, a royal soldier whose legacy is buried under military medals, romantic exploits, and a skeleton that may have told a quieter, crueler story, one of aching bones, decaying joints, and the telltale marks of a disease with no regard for nobility. 23. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, 1619 to 1682. Prince Rupert of the Rhine lived a life that would exhaust most biographers. Soldier, privateer, scientist, artist, colonial administrator. He was the kind of figure who seemed to spring from historical fiction, too dramatic to be real and too relentless to be ignored. Born into war, raised in exile, and eventually elevated to a position of near legendary status within the English Civil War, Rupert was many things. But delicate was not one of them. He is remembered most vividly as the Royalist, cavalry commander who slashed through parliamentarian forces with youthful zeal and continental flair. Tall, charismatic, and battle-hardened, Rupert became a symbol of royalist ferocity, and depending on whom you asked, either a romantic hero or a brutal opportunist. Yet behind the military campaigns and adventurous aura lies a man who, in his later years, began to deteriorate in a way that puzzled friends and physicians alike. And from those final decades, a theory has emerged quietly, carefully, and only in certain historical circles, that Prince Rupert, long after laying down his sword, may have suffered from the effects of syphilis. To be clear, Rupert's early years were marked more by action than affliction. He was wounded in battle multiple times, imprisoned by the Holy Roman Emperor as a teenager, and spent much of his youth galloping across Europe in a haze of military campaigns, political schemes, and noble appointments. He was dashing, erratic, and often polarizing, but never frail. Not then. The signs emerged later in the 1660s and 1670s after the Restoration dawned as Charles II reclaimed the throne, and Rupert returned to prominence as an admiral, investor, and founding figure of the Hudson's Bay Company. His body began to falter. He developed persistent joint pain, particularly in his hips and knees, and was frequently described as walking with difficulty. He withdrew from public engagements. His letters became less frequent and often mentioned. The ache of bones that do not answer the rest. By the 1670s, he was no longer the tireless figure of legend, but a man in visible pain. What makes the syphilis theory more than idle guesswork are the treatments and the silence that followed them. Rupert was reportedly treated with compounds that included mercury and antimony, both standard treatments for syphilis in the 17th century, particularly for those suffering from what was then called morbus gallicus, or the French disease. Physicians in his household never named the illness directly, but referred to a condition of deep-rooted origin and a disorder acquired abroad. These phrases, too polite to be diagnostic, strongly hint at a venereal source. Moreover, Rupert's later ailments included tremors, dental deterioration, vision problems, and cognitive fog, symptoms associated with tertiary syphilis, the form that affects the nervous system and organs after years of silent progression. Those who visited him during this time described him as uncharacteristically subdued, frequently agitated, or lost in his own weather. Gone was the sharp-tongued soldier who had once mocked Cromwell on the Fleet Watch. Battlefield. In his place was a figure increasingly burdened by something that could not be spoken of openly. Unlike many royals on this list, Rurt was not especially secretive about his earlier exploits. He fathered illegitimate children, maintained relationships with actresses and courtiers, and was widely known for his disregard for moral expectations. But illness, especially one associated with sexual conduct, remained taboo. And so whatever afflicted him in his final years remained cloaked in the same royal euphemisms that have buried so many similar stories: dropsy, infirmity, rheumatism of the spirit. He died in 1682 at the age of 62. No official cause of death was recorded, beyond a vague reference to natural decline. There was no scandal, no inquiry, no autopsy, just another royal death recorded with respect and averted eyes. But the body tells its own story even centuries later. And in Rupert's case, the pain, the treatments, the timeline, they all align with a disease that strips away legend over time, revealing only the ordinary, irreversible facts of human frailty. And what of those born into royal illegitimacy? The children of kings raised in shadow, never destined to rule, but still touched by the same afflictions, perhaps even more vulnerably. One such child died young, obscure in the historical record, but with enough troubling symptoms to suggest that the sins of the father were not buried quite so easily. 24. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, 1519 to 1536. In the Tudor world, illegitimacy wasn't always a curse. At least not if your father happened to be King Henry VIII. Henry Fitzroy, the king's only acknowledged illegitimate child, was born into a strange kind of royal twilight. He would never inherit the throne, but he was raised like a prince, given grand titles, and doted on by a monarch desperate for a male heir. At just 6 years old, Fitzroy was made Duke of Richmond in Somerset, and from that moment on, the court began to quietly speculate. Was this the boy Henry VIII intended to make his successor? It didn't happen. Fitzroy died suddenly at the age of 17 after years of recurring illness and unexplained weakness. The official cause was consumption, the catch-all term for what modern readers might recognize as tuberculosis. But even in his own time, some at court weren't convinced. His symptoms: pale complexion, wasting frame, chronic fatigue, and according to one source, rash and flux upon the limbs, didn't entirely match the tidy narrative of tuberculosis, nor did the treatments he received, which by some reports included mercury-based compounds. And when you add in the lingering shadowy question of his father's own health and the long-standing rumor that Henry VIII himself may have suffered from syphilis, another possibility begins to form. Could Henry Fitzroy have been born with congenital syphilis? It's a theory that has haunted Tudor historians for decades. If Henry VIII did indeed suffer from the disease, particularly in its latent stage during his many extramarital affairs, it's not inconceivable that he could have passed it on to a child, especially one conceived outside of marriage, with less medical oversight and no religious sanction. Fitzroy's mother, Elizabeth Blount, was a lady-in-waiting and the king's mistress. Their son was celebrated, but his early health was fragile. From a young age, Fitzroy was described as thin, often sickly, and prone to long absences from court due to delicate condition. Reports from his adolescence mention persistent fevers and a drawn, tired appearance. He never grew into the robust, athletic form so prized by his father. A Venetian ambassador once described him as a noble boy with the face of a ghost. His voice reportedly broke late, and his physical development lagged behind that of other young nobles. What's more intriguing and concerning is the rush to marry him off in 1533 to Mary Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. The marriage was political, but unusually hasty. Some historians have speculated that Henry VIII, aware of his son's declining health, pushed for the match to secure Fitzroy's dynastic value while there was still time. No children were produced from the union. In fact, there is no evidence the marriage was consummated, a detail that would later help Mary Howard retain her position at court. Fitzroy's death in 1536 was sudden, but not shocking to those who had watched his health slide for years. He died quietly away from court and was buried with little ceremony, a stark contrast to the grandeur of his short life. The king, famously sensitive to reminders of mortality, barely acknowledged the event. Some have read this as emotional repression. Others suggest something colder, that Henry, already obsessed with the idea of sin and divine punishment, feared the death said more about him than about the son. If Fitzroy did die from complications of congenital syphilis, it would mark one of the earliest and most tragic examples of royal succession being shaped by disease. A hidden illness passed from father to son, never spoken of, never recorded, but felt all the same in the silence that followed Dodd. It would also add a chilling layer to the speculation surrounding Henry VI himself, that his desperate quest for a healthy male heir was shadowed all along by an affliction he could neither outrun nor admit. The next heir had no such claims to paternity secrecy. A prince beloved, scandalous, and born into a new century of tabloids and telegraphs. And with him, the disease, or at least the rumor of it, would enter the modern age with all its contradictions, cover-ups, and carefully controlled photographs. 25. Edward, Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, 1894–1972. By the time Edward VII took the throne in 1936, he had already been a prince far longer than he would ever be a king. His reign lasted just 326 days, the shortest of any British monarch since the 11th century, and it ended not in war or deposition, but in a choice, the crown or the woman he loved. He chose the woman, and the abdication crisis became one of the most dramatic constitutional turning points in modern British history. But before the microphones and the exiles, before Wallace Simpson and the domino fall of royal succession, Edward was a young prince in the early 20th century, drifting from elite parties to foreign tours, building a public persona of charm and modernity. He was fashionable, athletic, and relentlessly photographed. He was also behind the smiles and sportswear, at the center of a quieter rumor, one that suggested his private life had left him with more than headlines. One that said the glamorous heir had at some point in his youth contracted syphilis. The theory has never been confirmed. No document names it. No doctor states it plainly. But like so many rumors surrounding the Windsor, it persists because of the void, the silences, the vague medical absences, the sudden interruptions in his schedule. In the 1920s and early 30s, Edward was endlessly visible, posing with dignitaries, inspecting troops, charming factory workers, and then periodically gone. Sometimes for weeks, sometimes due to fatigue, sometimes suffering from a cold, and occasionally just away for rest. What made observers suspicious was the consistency of these disappearances and the terminology used to explain them. In several cases, his absences were attributed to nerve strain, skin ailments, or glandular disturbances, all euphemisms common at the time for the recurring symptoms of syphilis. Moreover, there are scattered accounts buried in private correspondence and unofficial biographies of treatments that included injections of arsenicals and bismuth compounds, both widely used to treat syphilis before penicillin became available. One particularly compelling clue appears in the memoirs of a European diplomat who visited the prince in the late 1920s and remarked that Edward appeared troubled by a facial lesion which he disguised with powder, though he smiled through it like a professional. While this could have been something as innocuous as eczema, It added to the growing collection of physical hints that something was amiss. Even more intriguing is the behavior of the palace at the time. The Prince of Wales's health was treated as a matter of state secrecy. Doctors were sworn to silence. Rumors were aggressively managed by press agents. When reports surfaced in certain papers suggesting that the prince had suffered from a Parisian infection, a barely veiled code for a venereal disease, the palace moved swiftly to suppress them. These efforts were not unusual for the time, but the speed and thoroughness with which they acted suggests that the rumor hit closer to home than most. Then, there's the Wallis Simpson question. Edward's devotion to her was real, but biographers have long puzzled over the intensity of his dependency. Some have speculated that Edward feared emotional or physical abandonment in ways that seemed disproportionate. Unless perhaps he was hiding something and needed someone who knew and accepted it. Wallis herself, in letters, referred to Edward as needing care and not being well in the usual sense. Again, there is nothing definitive here, but the tone is intimate, protective, and quietly loaded. Edward lived a long life in exile, dying in 1972 at the age of 77. In later years, he appeared increasingly frail and withdrawn, suffering from circulatory problems and a slow physical decline that was largely attributed to age. But even then, the old whispers remained that the once glamorous prince had paid a price for the unroyal freedoms of his youth. No diagnosis was ever made public. No autopsy report is closed. The royal archives remained silent on the matter. And perhaps that's the perfect ending to this long-veiled lineage of rumored affliction. A modern prince surrounded by cameras, still living in the shadow of the same old secret. Because in the end, syphilis in royal history was never just a disease. It was a metaphor for legacy, for shame, for what couldn't be cured and what no crown could fully conceal. Asterisk.